Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar today, Complete Streets in Canada, Designing for Change. My name is Mozali Aziz, Program Associate at National Complete Streets Coalition. Just going to kick things off today. You're in for a treat this afternoon with transportation, engineering, and design experts, all specializing in complete streets from different provinces throughout Canada. To get things started, I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, Nancy Smith-Lee, who is Director of the Toronto Centre for Active Transportation. She's published several articles and led numerous research projects aimed at improving understanding and conditions for active transportation. And in 2011, she was awarded the Toronto Foundation's Vital People Grant for putting active transportation on the map. Without further ado, Nancy.
Thanks so much. So it's an absolute pleasure to be part of this webinar at TCAT. We've been inspired for close to a decade now by the movement that's happening in the U.S. and also by the work of the coalition. So I'm just going to move to the next slide. Okay, great. So so this is, as you can see on this map, we have Complete Streets are taking place across the country, and we now are in all 10 Canadian provinces and 2 of the 3 territories. So only Nunavut is missing. So just to give you a sense of what TCAT is doing around Complete Streets, so we've been playing a lead role in Canada to centralize the Complete Streets movement. And as I mentioned, we've been inspired by the National Complete Streets Coalition, but our model is a little bit different. Similarly, we have hosted a Complete Streets for Canada website that we launched in 2012, where we track progress of what's happening with Complete Streets across Canada. We've also been developing Canadian resources, so we've been doing case studies and design and policy tools. When practitioners want to understand what complete streets look like, they want to see examples from Vancouver or Oshawa or Halifax, which are all Canadian cities. So they want to see examples from their own country that will help them. And so we've done similarly, like last year, we put out a book called Complete Street Transformations, which profiled complete streets in the Ontario region. We've done some research projects. We are really interested in finding out what are practitioners actually calling complete streets, and what are the common characteristics of those streets, and are they achieving the goals that we set out for them, and what are the common outcomes. So we've delved into that with some research projects. We also, for several years, held an annual conference called the Complete Streets Forum. We were really pleased to have Barbara McCann, who was the founder of the National Complete Streets Coalition, as a keynote speaker for our kickoff conference. We've also developed a Complete Streets game. It's a community engagement tool to build consensus around building streets. We launched a beta version in 2013, and right now we're developing a more durable version of that tool that's made out of magnets in a box set. And it's going to be available this spring, and we're kind of excited about that coming out. And of course, we also do policy analysis, which is sometimes commissioned by municipalities. So I think probably most of you will be familiar with this slide, which shows is a pie chart kind of showing the various ways that complete streets policies are adopted in the U.S. And as most people probably know, there's more than 1,200 policies now. And typically the way that they are adopted in the U.S. is through resolutions, policies by elected boards, and legislation. And this just shows a pie chart of showing the how complete streets have been taken up in Canada. And so we have a slightly different policy context here. So you can see we have over 100 policies, and they're typically adopted into official plans and transportation master plans, and not as standalone policies. So it's a little bit handled a little bit different in terms of that policy uptake, but it is clearly a movement that's taking place in Canada as it is in the U.S. So we've spent a lot of time kind of thinking about these differences and how they've been playing out. So be happy to have more of a discussion about that after our presentations. So I'm now going to turn it over to our speakers. So we first have Peter Murphy, who is an urban designer with Quebec City's Urban Design and Landscape Architecture Division. In Quebec, he's been responsible for waterfront revitalization, long-term urban development plans, and coordinating Quebec City's new Complete Streets study. And from 1992 until 2004, he taught urban design theory and methods at Laval University School of Architecture, and over the course of his career has served on juries for several architectural competitions. Peter holds master's degrees in architecture and urban planning from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. We also have Ryan Martinson, who is a leader in the active and sustainable field at Stantec in their Calgary office. He's been involved with numerous game-changing transportation projects, all with the goal of creating stronger communities and better cities. And because of his approach to transportation planning and his understanding of how these concepts apply in real situations, Ryan has been invited to present his expertise to communities, municipalities, and professional organizations. And his goal is to make places better for people to travel through on foot and by bike. And so I'm now going to turn it over to Emiko Atherton, the Director of the National Complete Streets Coalition.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you also, Peter and Ryan, for joining us today. I feel like although this is the first time that we are doing a co-webinar, this has really been, for me, about 2 years in the making in conversations I've been having with people about complete streets in Canada. As Nancy mentioned, I do serve as the director of the National Complete Streets Coalition, which is a program of Smart Growth America. I do hope that someday we might be the International Complete Streets Coalition. We have been around since the beginning of the movement, helping to work with predominantly United States communities to adopt complete streets policies and then move towards implementation. Today I'm really proud to report that we have over 1,300 complete streets policies in the United States, but really our work is focused on moving those 1,300 policies into practice and then into projects for communities large and small, both on the West Coast, the East Coast, and the Midwest. I really, as I mentioned, I feel like this has been 2 years in the making for me because I was actually I met Peter first a little less than 2 years ago when I visited Quebec City, or Ville de Quebec, to hear about some of the great multimodal and active transportation work they're doing and their interest in complete streets. Since then, I've been able to meet Ryan and Nancy and really see some of the great work and see really in conversations I've had with everyone what really things we can learn from each other because I think, as Nancy mentioned, we have a slightly different approach from a policy framework, yet we face many of the same similar challenges in implementation, which has been really interesting and exciting. I am so excited to help kick off this webinar and hopefully a much longer partnership between the two countries and our work towards moving towards active transportation solutions and better safety options for users of all abilities. With that, I am going to turn it over to Peter. I was, again, able to visit Quebec City about 2 years ago, and since then they've made phenomenal progress on complete streets, and I'm really excited that he's able to share that with you today. So thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you, Emiko, and thanks for joining us, everybody. In an ideal world, all of Quebec City's streets and public spaces would be designed in accordance with complete streets principle. And in the long run, perhaps that will be the case. It would be a nice objective. But in the interim, to get from where we are today to there, the reality is that we have choices to make in allocating our professional and our financial resources so that we can assure that we can offer safe and comfortable transportation options for all user groups. So the question for us is, how can we identify priorities to assure that those choices will maximize the benefits to the population and help us build a fully integrated network of streets and public spaces? So to address those points today, I'd like to cover three subjects. First, a quick overview of Quebec City and what I call the 4 Ws. That is, some characteristics of the city's DNA. Second, our new complete streets approach and how we're implementing it in projects throughout the city. And finally, some of the advantages we see to this new approach and how it's helping to improve the quality of urban design in the city. So, Quebec City, where are we? What are we about? Quebec is a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1985. We're located about 300 miles north of Boston, about 450 miles north of New York, and about 600 miles north of Washington. And with a population of about 530,000 people, we are Canada's 11th largest city. So the first W is water. The city and its partners, especially Quebec's National Capital Commission and the Quebec Port Authority, are returning the St. Lawrence River to the population after decades of mostly industrial use. So to that end, major improvements, investments have been made to improving walking and biking up along not only the St. Lawrence but also the St. Charles River. And we've opened up over 45 kilometers or nearly 28 miles of riverfront for year-round public use. And the results have been pretty impressive. In 2017 alone, it's estimated that 3.5 million people visited the Samuel de Champlain promenade seen here in the upper right-hand corner, and its extension toward the west, the Sentier des Grèves. The second W is walls. Quebec City is one of North America's oldest human settlements. It was founded over 400 years ago, and it is the only fortified city in North America north of Mexico. We have over 4.5 kilometers of walls which encircle Old Quebec, and they are largely pedestrian accessible and offer links to many of the old city's public spaces and activities. The third W is winter. We are a true winter city. We're in the middle of a big snowstorm today, in fact. We receive an annual average snowfall of about 3 meters or 10 feet. So one of the many challenges for us in designing, animating, and maintaining streets and public spaces is to ensure that everybody can enjoy the city 12 months out of the year and in complete safety and comfort. And finally, downtown Quebec City is very walkable. We try to create a variety of pedestrian experiences, and increasingly we're looking toward flexible and shared street designs, which vary with the seasons or planned activities. For example, here in the middle we see the Grande Allée, where on-street parking is converted into a pedestrian circulation zone in the summer to allow adjacent restaurants and cafes to expand their outdoor terraces, or in the case of the Rue Saut-Matelot seen here on the bottom in the Old Port, which is a true shared street. So the question is, if Quebec City has all of these urban qualities, which in many ways could already be considered to meet complete streets objectives, why are we interested in that approach? Well, here's the thing. In 2002, the city was amalgamated with 12 surrounding communities, and overnight the population jumped from about 150,000 to over 500,000. Old Quebec fits into the orange circle seen here. That's less than 1% of the city's total land area. We have currently one of the world's most rapidly aging populations, along with that of Japan. We have a relatively low-density urban fabric outside of our downtown, and we also, like in many cities, see disparities between disadvantaged and better-off neighborhoods. So we have to maintain, but especially we have to adapt our extensive infrastructures and services, which in many cases were built during the baby boom years, and which have now reached the end of their useful lives. Just to give you an example, in 2017, our engineering department had over 900 street infrastructure projects covering approximately 300 kilometers of streets, or 180 miles, for a total investment of about $220 million. So the scale of the problem is enormous. So given these realities, how can the urban qualities that we see in and around Old Quebec, that is the human scale, the walkability, and say the connectivity among others, be applied to other neighborhoods while at the same time taking into account local identity? So that's why we turn to the Complete Streets approach. And the major turning point in our reflection came when our host today, Emiko, as she mentioned, helped to explain the Complete Streets approach here in 2016 at a symposium. And in particular, I think what interested a lot of participants was when she explained how cities have the flexibility to adapt it to their own needs and priorities. As well, at that same symposium, we heard from Gil Peñalosa from the 880 Foundation in Toronto, who proposed that if everything we do on our cities is great for 8-year-olds, but also for 80-year-olds, then by default it will be great for all people. And as well, we heard from Jean-Pierre Després, who's a renowned researcher in cardiovascular health and preventive medicine at the Quebec Health Alliance, who launched a call for action, for getting people up and moving about the city. And I think one message that united these presentations was simple. We're all working toward the same objectives for improving our urban environment, but it's essential, absolutely essential, to break down silos to facilitate information sharing. So to that end, an interdisciplinary working group was formed by the city to develop a shared vision for a comprehensive and systematic approach so that we could rapidly and accurately assess the potential for creative, inclusive, dynamic, and safe streetscapes. And the vision that was agreed upon for defining those priorities was how we could support and improve citizens' well-being and quality of life, which must be placed at the center of the decision-making process. And while it may seem relatively obvious, that vision helps keep all discussions and decisions focused on what is really truly essential to delivering projects that best reflect citizens' needs. The group's analyses also confirmed that there were, in fact, already many excellent documents and guides for improving streets and public spaces that were directly related to quality of life issues. However, they also realized that too often those tools and knowledge remain sectorial, and that we lacked a fully integrated transdisciplinary approach, which needed to be put in place to more adequately address quality of life issues, especially early on in the planning and design processes. So more precisely, the question was, what should we be aiming for in terms of the performance of our streets and public spaces? So certain targets had already been defined in our Sustainable Mobility Plan from 2011, most notably to double the modal share of public transit by 2030, to increase active travel by about 13%, and decrease motorized travel by about 20%. So with those targets in mind, the working group then sought to first define the needs of the most vulnerable user groups, that is, pedestrians, cyclists, and transit users, to create a better balance in space allocation. So to do so, they proposed three axes which would serve as references for evaluating the performance of our streets. The first one was the development of active streets, so that we would prioritize the pedestrian experience and human scale so as to stimulate intermodality and transit use, but also to value physical activity for a healthy city. The second one was the development of green streets to give a priority to eco-responsible interventions by improving the tree canopy, especially in underprivileged neighborhoods, and by reducing impermeable surfaces throughout the city. But also to see how we could contribute to sustainable improvements in air and water quality through innovations in landscape architecture. And finally, the third was to develop streets adapted to our winter reality, so that we could enable the population to remain active throughout the year and in complete safety, but also to contribute to making winter an engine of activity so that we could all experience the city to its full potential 12 months out of the year. That working group also analyzed socio-demographic data, and which pointed to important differences between disadvantaged and better off neighborhoods. As well, numerous professional resources from public health and research were consulted to help us identify those health indicators, which could be influenced by the quality of the urban environment. And the results permitted the working group to retain the notion of linking design decisions to sustainable health, which is defined as a comprehensive state of physical, mental, and social well-being. And this is, I think, where the process gets quite unique. To help translate these objectives into action, we turned to a research team from Laval University that was specialized in decision systems, including a professor from the business school, planning professor, and a graduate student. And with the working group, they recommended the development of a multi-criteria database using software, a program called Macbeth, which would allow us to integrate quantitative data, but also qualitative judgments, so that we could evaluate the relative attractiveness of different options for our street design. And over the course of that research, we also hired 4 graduate students in urban design from Laval's School of Architecture, who worked with us in developing and refining our analyses and methodology. That methodology was developed through a series of meetings, during which the 12 base criteria seen here, which all have a direct influence on the quality of the pedestrian experience, were defined. And for each one of them, it was essential that we define metrics so that we could then visualize them and map them using ArcGIS that would then allow us to create a series of overlays. And so using those basic criteria as a departure point, we then compared hypothetical scenarios for different street designs by controlling for variables so that we could define those street typologies which would offer the most opportunities for facilitating active transportation. Those choices were then encoded into the software program, which also verified their consistency, and then it generated street hierarchies for our 2,400 kilometers, or nearly 1,500 miles of streets within the city. So here we see an excerpt from that mapping tool. Streets are prioritized into 10 levels so that we can visualize the relative potential of each one of them in creating an overall network oriented toward public active transportation. And so those streets which offer the most potential for creating that network are indicated in tones of red, orange, and yellow, and those which offer a relatively lower potential for creating that network are indicated in tones of blue, turquoise, and green. But it's important to note that even if a street is ranked relatively low in this analysis, we will still look at them to see how we may be able to improve certain conditions in the short run at the local level and larger neighborhood issues in the long run. And in so doing, what we can rapidly see is not only where we should be placing our effort, but also we can see, visualize potential linkages between different streets, different sectors, different neighborhoods, which we might not have seen had we looked at the projects individually as we used to do beforehand. So with decisions being made using these data-informed analyses, we feel we're able to eliminate arbitrary decisions in the final design. And all projects are evaluated using the same criteria. So in essence, the city has leveled the playing field. And it permits us to target urban environments which will offer the most potential for improving citizens' quality of life. We also feel it's a transparent process. All criteria are known ahead of time for all participants, from citizens all the way up to elected officials. And as a visual tool, it helps facilitate the communications between all stakeholders and is designed for regular information updates or the addition of additional indicators. However, in terms of its limits, it's not a design tool. It does not replace the final judgment of professionals or elected officials. And we have to be careful because it can be influenced by street segmentation. For example, in the case that we see here at the bottom of the screen, the Chemin Sainte-Foy and the Rue Saint-Jean, which is a street that was highly classified in the multi-criteria analysis. But we have to be careful because it passes through 3 different distinct neighborhoods. So we cannot just adopt one design for the street. We have to look at it at a much finer level and adapt the overall design to the immediate urban and built context. So to overcome these limits, we realized that another level of analysis was needed to arrive at a more complete evaluation of a street's potential and design. So those streets which offer the most potential, that is approximately 25% of all streets which are in the red, orange, and yellow categories, are then referred to a standing committee which analyzes those projects with an additional 28 criteria. For example, access to community and health services, access to healthy and affordable food choices, planned transportation projects, the presence of urban heat islands, etc. So this standing committee then prioritizes the components which should be included in the final design. They prepare design options, and then in working with our communications department, they define the public consultation process as needed. Concerning public input into this process, to date, 3 public consultation tools have been developed and are used either individually or in combination with one another, according to the complexity of the design and or community issues. So what we find is that by crossing the multi-criteria analysis with the performance criteria as, and those related to sustainable health, we feel that the results offer stakeholders a thorough portrait of a street's potential. And what is interesting is that software had never been used for identifying priorities for streets and public spaces as proposed here. So between an existing street and an ideal street, what we find is that often the right-of-way is insufficient to accommodate all of the components that may be identified or hoped for. So that's where these various design filters come into play, which allow us to define options for residents so that the final design, the improved street, best responds to their expectations and needs. Since initiating the study in 2015, we've undertaken several pilot projects to validate and improve our methodology. I'd just like to show you a few examples of streets that were designed using this approach to show just the range of possibilities that can be planned for using this process. In the case of the Rue du Pont, it's in the Saint-Roch neighborhood near downtown. It plays a major role in connecting neighborhoods on either side of the St. Charles River. And after consultations with residents and business owners, it was agreed to convert it from a typical two-way urban street into a one-way street with the addition of bike lanes. In so doing, the space reserved for pedestrians, cyclists, and greenery increased by about 75%. And initially, the only costs associated with this project were for signage and painting. And since then, for example, a new bike counter has been installed in 2017, which confirms that there's been a fourfold increase in the number of cyclists along the street. We have now up to 1,000 per day using it during the peak summer period. Second project is St. John and Turnbull Streets, and here pedestrian safety, increased vegetation, in addition of bike lanes were requested by the population in an online survey and confirmed in a public design workshop. These investments represent an increase of only 4% of the total budget, but I think demonstrates that substantial improvements are possible with minimal financial impacts when they are defined early on in the process. In the case of Ducharme Avenue and Émile Fontaine Streets, they're located in the Vanier neighborhood, which is a post-World War II suburb close to downtown along the St. Charles River. And the top priority here was to increase the tree canopy. So to do so, the road width was reduced by about 45%, which represents a savings of over 2,000 square meters or over 20,000 square feet of asphalt. As well, there have been substantial savings for our Public Works Department in snow removal costs. And with this recuperated space, we added a second sidewalk, which links up schools, parks, and a daycare center. And we also have been able to plant 50 large-scale trees, mostly elms, in this recuperated green space. In the case of Centime of Speed, it's in the Saint-Sauveur neighborhood, which is close to downtown. It's a more disadvantaged neighborhood with very limited tree cover. And in conformity with priorities that were identified by residents in an online survey, interventions here included widened sidewalks, improved pedestrian crossings, new trees, planting strips, and a pocket park seen here at a strategic intersection. In addition, to better respond to their needs, part of the street became one-way, so automobile speed has been reduced, and it offers opportunities for additional greening. In the case of the Chemin de la Canadière, which is also nearing completion, here what's interesting is that a new public square was built after the design had been tested over several years in the context of a tactical urbanism project. We've added bike lanes and nearly 100 trees have been planted. Widened sidewalks are obstacle-free and in many parts are textured for the visually impaired. And the intersection seen here has been raised to sidewalk level. So we've eliminated a frequent source of accidents for pedestrians in winter. It also contributes to a reduction in automobile speed and is designed as an extension of the new public square. What's also interesting here is with these changes, the space reserved for pedestrians, cyclists, and greenery has increased from about a quarter of the right-of-way to nearly half. And the Rue de l'Église is one of our major street design projects for the next several years. It's located in the suburban neighborhood of Saint-Foy, which is also a post-World War II suburb. Priorities here include on equal footing improvements to pedestrian and cyclist comfort and safety, as well as the addition of greenery. Once again, the sidewalks will be significantly widened. Will also, of course, be barrier-free. And we will be building a bidirectional bike track, which will be separated from automobile traffic by planting strips. In terms of greenery, this design allows us to plant approximately 170 trees and will also allow for about 1,000 square meters of shrubs and perennials, which will allow us to increase the tree canopy here from about 9% to nearly 40% of the right-of-way. And finally, we are currently working with consultants, residents, and business owners to see how we can improve comfort and safety of pedestrians and cyclists in and around the historic center. And a major challenge here concerns sidewalks. When, because of snow and ice accumulation seen here in the upper left, they can become practically impassable in winter. As well, drivers along local streets have difficulty with short-term parking needs and are often forced to jump curbs and park on the sidewalk. So the strategy that we've adopted for local streets includes placing the stormwater drains in the middle of the right-of-way and connecting downspouts directly to them to evacuate water as quickly as possible. In addition, sidewalks are lowered to create, in essence, a form of shared street. So because we've diminished or limited the level changes along sidewalks, there's also improved safety for pedestrians, especially for those with limited mobility. The streets where this design has been completed and the other streets where it may be applied are examples of those which were relatively low in the multi-criteria analysis that I showed a little earlier, but they still offer interesting opportunities to better adapt all streets to the needs of local residents. So just to recap, in terms of improving the quality of the service to the population, we find that this new complete streets approach, which is designed around data-based decision-making, helps us create a process which is more transparent, rational, and equitable for all residents. In addition, we find that as a visual planning tool, it helps us rapidly identify and communicate design priorities and issues to all stakeholders, which also contributes to increased efficiency throughout the process. In many cases, we see savings in the planning and design processes of between 6 and 9 months, and even in some cases up to over a year. And while it is important for us to keep a citywide vision for improving living environments, it also allows us to remain sensitive to local identity and needs. So it allows us to apply it in urban as well as suburban environments, and we can also adapt it to existing, but also, even more importantly, to new street design. So this new approach, this new complete streets approach, it's still a work in progress. Further testing and judgments will likely be needed before a full rollout is completed in 2019. But maybe I would suggest that beyond improvements to the street planning and design processes, perhaps the most important contribution of this approach is that it has helped put all stakeholders, citizens, city professionals, elected officials, all on the same page by raising greater awareness of the importance of streetscapes to the quality of our urban environments and the quality of life in the city. So it's basically helping us to place our efforts in the right investment at the right spot at the right time. So thank you very much. If you'd like any information, additional information about this approach, you can consult the city's website. The address is seen here at the bottom of the page, in French only for the moment. Thanks a lot for your attention. Looking forward to your questions, and I'll turn the mic over to Ryan.
Wow, that was super cool there, Pierre.
Thanks.
I'm going to chat about kind of the design and the implementation end of things. I think Peter did a great job hitting on all those different aspects too, even getting down into the street design stuff. So I'll see if I can fill the gaps. I'm a transportation engineer by training, but deal with things from transportation planning, strategy, policy, alignment, and then down to concept designs too. So hopefully that perspective is useful. So to start things off, NIMBY in Canada is not in my back igloo. As you saw from Peter's pictures before, we do have a very similar built environment. So we don't live in igloos. We don't live in ice palaces. Those do exist in Canada, and you can go visit them, but our built environment is very similar. And the people that we're designing for are human beings. They're not moose or polar bears, and that's not our, at least in the majority of Canada, not considerations. In some parts of Canada, I've been to talks on Safer to School programs that have dealt with polar bear issues, but that would be a very small group of Canadians. So we're not we don't actually have that much of a different built environment as you saw before. So for us, and I guess how I think about things too, I used to get pretty upset when I would hear, well, we just have a car culture, and this car culture is something that can't change. So I was digging into that a bit more, and this idea of culture, and this is one of the definitions that is out there that I found and that I enjoyed and kind of found useful. But it's basically the values that people hold, the rules and the norms that they obey, and the material objects that they use. And it's this system of shared meanings that we have, and it's the way of our life. And thinking about this now too, I guess it does make sense how we do have a car culture in parts of North America, and it can be explained in terms of material objects that we use to move around, if it's predominantly for automobile travel, for example. The different values that and the priorities that we've set in different areas, and that kind of explains how our built environment's involved, and also the rules and the norms, so the guides that we've had, the standards or the laws that we've adapted and taken on have had a bias to them in past. And so thinking about this and this idea of all these different components that come into play, it does seem that we're able to still change, though, our culture and think about obviously providing more options for people to travel by various modes, the sharing of different technology or of mobility devices. Things like Vision Zero and chats about equity and morality around the values end of things are definitely bringing components that have been kind of hidden or under the carpet a bit. They're bringing them to the front. And then the guides and standards and laws that we have are changing and bringing into a much more multimodal and human-centered design. So one of the projects that I was involved with a number of years ago now was the Complete Streets guidelines for the city of Edmonton. It was one of the first Complete Streets guides in Canada, and what we were focusing on in that project is this idea of it's about a process versus a prescription. So we don't want to be prescriptive on what a street design should look like. It's about having that conversation and making trade-offs, especially in retrofit situations. We can't have an extremely wide right-of-way. We want to keep things tight, and we want to be smart about how we use things, so we need to make trade-offs and have discussions about that. So it's going through the process rather than being prescriptive and providing blanket statements or blanket cross-sections to our environments in terms of how we want to change. So that was one of the guides that we were involved with. What we do a lot of times, just bringing it back to the Canada idea, is think about Complete Streets as well as not as you don't have a complete box of hockey cards or a complete box of baseball cards, if that's your thing. You don't need to have all 445 cards in order to make a complete set necessarily when we're talking about street design. What we're talking about is making sure that we have different elements, and it's a network approach, and it's about the trade-offs that you're making within the fabric of the urban environment, rather than about providing something for everybody in one single cross-section. Otherwise, the cross-section gets unwieldy. So another thing that we're involved with my colleague Tyler Gawley up in Edmonton was the Main Streets guidelines, which looked at design flexibility and different ways that you can use parts of the street to either have, say, like parklets or an example, or provide different amenities based on the context and even just the adjacent land uses. This idea is really important for designers and admittedly might be a little bit uncomfortable too to have this type of flexibility, but understanding that you can change and adapt within your city and within different contexts is really important to make sure that we have human-scaled designs. Another project that Stantec was involved with WSP was the rewrite of our national guidance. So the last time it was published by the Transportation Association of Canada was in 1999, and a lot has changed, obviously, in the world, and especially within transportation practices. There's been a lot more research and a lot more understanding in terms of what people need and how we move about. So in 2017, that was the new guide that was published over this past summer. And using bicycles as an example, there are a number of different elements that have changed, but the bicycle section of this national guidance really highlights what the big change in my mind is. But it's changing from this idea of bicycles as vehicles, or the idea of how do we move these tools, regardless of maybe transit, might be cars, to how do we move people riding bicycles around. So it's a human-centered focus and a user-centered design. So there's human beings and there's stuff between their ears that are influencing their decisions and that are making them feel comfortable or uncomfortable or making decisions. And so the design process around that is a lot more, is now encapsulated better within our design guidance. And and we can see that in some of the recommendations and the things that we're able to have within our streets. Also a big focus too, before it was on rural roadways, and now obviously with a lot of transportation occurring within urban areas, and most of our urban our population is living within urban areas, that focus is now occurring. Here's just a few charts to highlight this, again from the bicycle section, but it's throughout the chapters that have been rewritten. There's a tendency towards more separation for bicycle users based on research and design users' considerations. So the idea of the wide curb lane being adequate, or using sharrows in order to provide a bicycle facility. There's only specific contexts where that's now appropriate, and it's recognized in the guidance. There's things like two-stage turn boxes, which weren't dealt with before in past guidance, and even protected intersections, which I find is pretty awesome to have within national guidance, to be able to talk about the design of these and using those treatments that we've seen elsewhere now within Canada. Another thing about complete streets in Canada is we always hear about how everything's cold and everything's snowy. And some people may use that as an excuse, but I think more of it is it's just a design consideration. So it's just a thing that you need to think about when you're doing your design. This next slide here is from some past work that we were doing in Calgary, talking about this idea that there's colder and snowier places that have a higher percentage of work trips by bicycle, so places like Montreal and Minneapolis. Now this information is dated, but it does go to show and help with that story that there's something more than the fact that there's snowflakes and that there's colder temperatures. And so what we do now within our design is think about that maintenance and operation aspect. An example that you can, for the skiers out there, thinking of a blue run, for example, so a pretty moderate ski run. It's accessible to many people, but if you leave it unmaintained, moguls start to appear, and so these bumps on the hills are now things that you have to move around, and you can play with them too and have fun with them and enjoy yourself if you're a mogul person. But it quickly makes this blue run that used to be accessible to many people only available to a select few, and it might be the people that are more willing to take more risk. This picture on the bottom right now shows, people aren't willing to travel through snow. That's a cycle track that hasn't been cleared just yet, and they're willing to still bicycle in the winter time, but they do need to have some basic operations and maintenance covered, and that would be clear of snow, or basically clear of any type of obstacle. Also, what we've noticed when we've done some designs in Calgary and in Edmonton in particular recently is thinking about the design vehicle. So the size of the bicycle, so cargo bikes or bikes with trailers are something that is important to think about, but also think about that maintenance equipment that's going to be going down, say, your protected bikeway. What is the width of that, and what does it need to be accommodated? A lot of times that's actually what's dictating our designs, instead of the width of the operating envelope of a person riding a bike, because it might be a pickup truck with a sweeper or a plow on the front of it. And so that will dictate the designs, and making sure that you have good operations and those maintenance considerations baked into your design is important, so that you can keep your infrastructure rolling and keeping it rolling out into the future, and it's not seen as a hindrance. What we've also done, and I'm going to give some examples here, but it show this value to the citizens and the people that you're creating these designs for through the use of rapid implementation. So two examples that we have. Recently, we were helping the City of Edmonton, and then the City of Edmonton took it upon themselves to design and implement an entire grid of separated bikeways into their downtown, and it fills the central gap and into the heart of Edmonton, and really gets people to be able to experience their city in a different way than they had before. if you're a musician, you then choose to obviously play a trombone on your bicycle, but you have kids that are now feeling comfortable because it's almost an extension of the pathway system, for example. And people are able to embrace this and travel at a human scale through their cities. Another example is the implementation of Calgary's bike facilities, a bike network. It was 6.5 kilometers. And this happened before the city, but it showed that idea that this is possible and that we can show the value of a network rather than a single route all at once and have people figure that out. So this is what the network looked like in Calgary. It is a smaller network, as my colleague Tyler likes to point out, but we did help pave the way, as I like to push back at him. And this is what it looks like, the before and after. So these big streets, it's either scooting a travel lane or a parking lane over in order to create this space. And then it was night and day from when this was implemented, the human aspect of it. And you do have then families taking their children downstairs or downtown because you can go, it's an extension of the pathway network again, and you can explore your city. And I've taken kids' school classes down to explore it. I've seen a mom that was teaching her son how to ride her bike on this network even. And the use of engagement. So engaging people. Sometimes this is a nuanced approach I find between the U.S. and Canada, or even just Canada and other places too. And it certainly varies within Canada. But the level of engagement that you want to do with stakeholders and the public in order to field information and insights into what you're trying to design. So what's different in Canada? Well, in Canada, our physics looks like this. So the kinetic energy is half the mass times the volume squared of an object. And I use this to talk about vehicles. And a big, heavy object moving pretty quickly has a ton of kinetic energy. But really, that's the same as the United States, and it's actually kind of a universal law. In Canada, speed kills. And this is the exact same thing in the United States as well, where we have the speed of the severity and risk of death increasing when the vehicle speed increases as well. Regardless of mode, in this case, it's for people walking. In Canada, we create tools as extensions of ourselves. So in Canada, we have smartphones that act as extensions of our voice and our communication skills, or we use hammers and wrenches as extensions of our hands because we're not as strong, or bicycles or cars or buses to move around as extensions of our legs. And I think that's probably still very similar to other places in the world as well. And in Canada, we have positions, interests, and values. And we have a tendency to pick positions, A versus B, bikes versus no bikes. But when you do talk to people, you can get down into to find out what their interests are, and you do find that there's some shared interests. And if you have further conversations, you can find out that there are shared values. And, actually, this is a pretty universal idea, too. And just to take this completely off the rails, in Canada and everywhere in the world, everybody poops. And it's not, not to have just a gigantic poop emoji as the last couple slides for me, but it does bring back this idea that we have human needs, wants, and desires, and we do need to make sure that we're treating people in a very equal and in a fair way, and that we're all humans and we're all trying to achieve something in the end, and it's usually around comfort and safety and enjoying life. And so making sure that we have a good built environment that does provide that and recognize that there's a human element to this is really important. So just to wrap, for my stuff, thinking about the idea that culture change is possible and the different elements that we can be involved in terms of changing this culture. The idea of complete streets as a process versus a prescription. Weather's just a thing and something that we can be designing with and for. We can make changes fast to show value to our elected officials and to our citizenship. And also, let's focus on human-centered design because that's when we're going to get our better results. So with that, I think I turn it over to Nancy if they haven't cut me off for that giant poop emoji at the end.
Thanks so much, Ryan. I'm just going to ask each of you a couple of questions, and then I want to turn this over to the participants on the call. And I see there's a bunch of questions there waiting, and so please feel free to type in your questions if you have them. So Ryan, I'm just going to start with you. It's so interesting to hear about the progress that's been made in Alberta, and in some ways it's really it's more so than we've seen in other parts of the country. And Calgary adopted the first complete streets policy, and we're seeing this kind of rapid implementation approach in Edmonton and Calgary. I think that's kind of the envy of other Canadians. I'm wondering. Certainly in Toronto, it's where I am. Bike lanes continue to be kind of political footballs and take years to get approved and implemented. I'm just wondering if you have any kind of words of wisdom for other municipalities in achieving that kind of rapid implementation approach. And also, I'm just a kind of two-part question. In your experience, has it helped to turn skeptics into supporters more quickly than with a more incremental approach?
Perfect. Yeah. You mentioned that I'll have some words of wisdom, so that might set the bar a bit high. But at least my observations right now, I think it was a really smart decision, and it wasn't planned right off the bat to implement a network of protected bikeways in downtown Calgary. It was something that we had to, and something that was suggested to us in order to make sure that our project didn't die. The original plan was just to do this as a single route per year based on construction seasons, and eventually you'll have a network. But what we were what was being realized is that there's the benefit to having a network, and that benefit won't be realized until the end, maybe 4 or 5 years from now. And that might be too long for people to wait and actually be patient with this process. So doing it all at once really helped with that buy-in. It does show value. You can leverage off of the benefit of a network. And I think it did change some people's perceptions of the value and the usefulness of these facilities in the downtown and in our city as well. It's still a very difficult conversation to have, but I think you can show that there's the benefit of people using it, and you can get into the weather and winter and those type of data conversations as well when you measure the crap out of it. But it's really helpful to have that entire network instead of pull a Band-Aid off at once, and instead of doing it multiple times. And I will mention, if anyone on the call is interested in about the process for Calgary, I have a comic book, kind of an origin stories on the planning and the policy of that I'd be happy to share around, or maybe I'd provide to Complete Streets.
Awesome, Ryan. So it sounds like the measurement was also important in Calgary as it was in Quebec City, and Peter, I just want to ask you a question. Then we're going to turn it over to some of the questions we have on the call. It's so inspiring to hear about Quebec City and the ambitious policy that you've adopted there. And it's kind of been noted that it's one of Canada's most ambitious complete streets policies. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit more about why that is, and if it's you talked about that decision-making software that helps to prioritize streets and the streets that have the best potential. I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit more about why that is, and if there's and also just a little bit more about that software, if that software is available for other cities to use.
Right. Well, first off, in terms of our ambitions, as I mentioned, we're targeting 25% of all of our city streets. And the framework, just to maybe make a link with that, the software, it's helping us really identify those streets which are connected, for example, to routes to school, to commercial streets, neighborhood services, and whatnot. So we have an objective of 25%. Now, you have to understand also that many of these streets already meet the complete street standards. So if we realize that some of these streets already are in conformity with our objectives, then that allows us to really move down the hierarchy and continue to target other streets that maybe were slightly lower in the ranking. And I think Ryan touched on a point also. I'd just like to maybe address that quickly in terms of the prescription, the prescriptive nature of different policies. And what we're finding is that because it's an open policy, that we're not presenting necessarily fixed designs, but we're presenting options to people, to decision makers, to citizens. It helps them get involved and engaged in the process. And so it allows us to make a really efficient process, and it's helping move the process along much quicker and helping us to really prioritize the streets much more rapidly than beforehand. So I think it's in this sense that it's considered to be one of Canada's more ambitious projects in that we do have these targets. And but also as a large-scale framework for the whole street network, it really does allow us to intervene at different levels. As I mentioned, we have these short-term interventions, but we also can also start thinking about, well, what are the more long-term objectives for some of these neighborhoods which might be more isolated, might be more removed, might be less well-served by active transportation or by public transportation. So it really helps frame not only our complete streets policy, but also has a lot of impact on other planning tools and documents within the city. So I think it's really, for us, it's been a really positive overall framework for organizing our work and identifying those priorities. I don't know if I've answered your question adequately, Nancy, but
thank you. That's awesome, Peter. And I see we're just 1 minute away before 2. I don't know if we have a time for another question. Perhaps Nimota can help with that. But in the meantime, until we get cut off, I'll just loop over to these questions here. There's one question. I guess this one's also for you, Pierre. Are these projects coordinated with your standard renewal capital budget or funded as a standalone project that's prioritized with the software in analysis?
That's a whole other aspect that I didn't get into. It's quite complicated. But generally speaking, these projects are coordinated with our engineering department. And there are projects where our engineers have identified a need to intervene for one reason or another. And so what we've tried to do is the multi-criteria analysis that I presented is used by our engineering department as an overlay. And they will overlay their projects, for example, the projects that I've identified to be undertaken this year or next year. And they will automatically refer those red, orange, and yellow, red, orange, and yellow streets to our standing committee. So generally speaking, these projects are included in our capital improvements budget, and it allows us really to reflect on how we should really allocate the different resources and invest in the different forms, the different interventions that are needed in each one of those projects. So that's why on the screen I put the differences between the initial budget and the final budget to incorporate all of these different improvements. Because in many cases, as we saw especially in the first example, the additional costs, additional investments are relatively minor. So it's helped also, I think it relieves a lot of people, a lot of decision makers. When we talk about complete streets, I think they have this idea that it's going to be very expensive. And I think we're finding that it's just a question of reallocating resources, re-identifying our priorities, and we're able to, I think, achieve some interesting results using that method. So it's basically within our capital improvements budget. If ever we want improvements that go beyond that, then they are financed within other capital improvement budgets from other services other than just the engineering department.
Awesome. Thank you. I think we are out of time. Am I right?
Hi, Nancy. Thank you. I just wanted to thank all of our presenters for their time today and sharing their insights and expertise. We're going to wrap it up. I just wanted to make a plug for the next webinar in the Complete Streets series that will be happening next month, Improving Mobility Access Through Complete Streets and Mobility Management. That'll be happening on February 21st from 12:30 to 1:30 Eastern Time. And I will add that we will be sending a PDF of the presentation and the recording by the end of the week, and we will follow up with other questions with our presenters and get some of those answered as well. So you will be receiving emails about both of those in the coming weeks. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. See you, everyone.